The room is silent except for the scrape of boots on concrete. Inside a military courtroom in Maiduguri, a Nigerian Army sergeant steps forward. His uniform neatly pressed, his posture rigid. He does not look like a traitor. He looks like a man who has stood guard in the heat-counted bullets by hand and followed orders without question. Yet the charges read aloud sound almost unthinkable: stealing ammunition, illegally dealing in arms, and aiding the enemy. This is not a general. This is not a politician. This is a sergeant entrusted with weapons meant to protect Nigeria from Boko Haram and ISWAP. According to the Nigerian Army's own public statements, investigators say he did the opposite. Over time, ammunition vanished from the stockpile under his control. Money, tens of millions of naira, flowed into his bank account, far beyond what a soldier at his rank could ever earn. In September 2025, he and other security personnel were convicted under a sweeping internal crackdown known as Operation Snowball. The Army announced life sentences, it announced arrests, it announced accountability, but it did not announce the full damage, because Operation Snowball did more than expose individual corruption. It peeled back the surface of a system already under strain, a system fighting a brutal war while relying on paper records, inconsistent oversight, and soldiers who often feel abandoned by the very institutions they serve. And when a system like that cracks, the consequences do not stay inside courtrooms. Just weeks later, in Nigeria's embattled northeast, a senior commander, Brigadier General Musa Uba, was ambushed and killed. Days after that, schoolgirls were abducted from a guarded school shortly after troops were withdrawn. Again and again, Nigerians were left asking the same quiet, unsettling question: how do attackers always seem to know when protection is thinnest? This story is not about accusing without evidence. It is about patterns that refuse to disappear, about lives lost when weapons leak, information fails, and trust erodes from the inside out. It is about what happens when a war against terror is weakened not only by enemies in the forest, but by failures within the system meant to stop them. So tonight I want to ask you something simple but uncomfortable. Can a nation win a war when it can no longer fully trust itself? If you believe this question matters, if you believe the truth is more important than official headlines, please stay with me, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to be part of this conversation. To understand why Operation Snowball shook Nigeria's security establishment, we have to begin with what the military itself publicly acknowledged and what it quietly left unsaid. In September 2025, the Nigerian Army announced the convictions of several serving security personnel for crimes that cut to the heart of the country's war against insurgency. These were not battlefield mistakes. They were deliberate acts of betrayal. At the center of the case was Sergeant Raphael A., an armorer assigned to safeguard weapons and ammunition meant for operations against Boko Haram and ISWAP. According to evidence presented at his court-martial, large quantities of ammunition disappeared from the stockpile under his control over a period of years. Investigators traced 45.7 million naira flowing into his personal bank account, an amount wildly inconsistent with the official salary of a Nigerian sergeant. Prosecutors argued that the money represented payments for ammunition diverted to criminal and insurgent networks. Sergeant Raphael A. was not alone. The military said his conviction was part of a broader internal crackdown known as Operation Snowball, a nationwide investigation targeting security operatives accused of selling weapons and ammunition to criminals. By the Army's own count, 33 security personnel, including soldiers and police officers, were arrested under this operation. Among them was Inspector Enoch Unwa, a mobile police officer accused of facilitating the movement of weapons across checkpoints. Investigators traced 135 million naira through his bank account transactions classified as suspicious. Another was Sergeant Sadiq Adamu, an armorer serving in Jos, with 34 million naira in unexplained inflows. Lance Corporal Patrick Ock was accused of diverting a colleague's rifle during communal violence. Corporal Omido Rufus was accused of selling ammunition to a police officer. In September 2025, the Army announced that several of these individuals had been tried and sentenced, some to life imprisonment, others to long prison terms. On paper, this looked like accountability, public trials, public convictions, strong language from military leadership. Operation Snowball was presented as proof that the system could police itself. But what quickly became clear was that this operation exposed more than individual crimes. It revealed the fragility of the system those individuals had exploited. Across many Nigerian Army formations, weapons and ammunition are still logged manually using paper registers rather than digital tracking systems. Military officials themselves have acknowledged this weakness. In 2025, the Director General of the National Center for the Control of Small Arms and Light Weapons publicly warned that poor armory management within security agencies was fueling the proliferation of illegal weapons nationwide. This is the environment in which Operation Snowball unfolded. Investigators testified that ammunition registers had been falsified, rounds recorded as expended during training exercises had in reality vanished. The exact quantities allegedly diverted were never released. The military did not disclose where the stolen ammunition ultimately went, nor did it publish an assessment of the operational damage caused by these breaches. That silence matters. Independent reporting by Reuters and Premium Times noted that the Nigerian Army itself has long linked arms diversion from official stockpiles to the country's worsening insecurity. Weapons stolen from military depots have repeatedly resurfaced in the hands of jihadist groups, bandits, and criminal networks. While investigators did not publicly detail how the weapons moved or which groups ultimately received them, analysts point to Nigeria's fragmented weapons economy driven by corruption, poverty, and relentless demand from multiple armed actors as the pathway that allows diverted arms to travel far from their point of origin. Operation Snowball then did not reveal a single rogue sergeant or a handful of bad actors. It revealed a network operating inside a system riddled with gaps wide enough for ammunition to disappear, money to flow, and accountability to arrive only after irreversible damage had been done. And perhaps most troubling of all, military officials themselves admitted that what they uncovered was likely bigger than one man, bigger than one unit, bigger than one case. They believed they were exposing something structural, a vulnerability that does not just traffic weapons, but quietly reshapes the balance of a war. Operation Snowball was not the end of the story. It was the warning shot. If Operation Snowball was the warning, what happened next felt like the consequence. In November 2025, Nigeria's long-tormented Northeast delivered a blow that shook the military to its core. Somewhere along a familiar route near Wajoko, close to Damboa in Borno State, a Nigerian Army convoy moved through territory it had traveled countless times before. At its head was Brigadier General Musa Uba, a senior commander deeply involved in operations against ISWAP, one of the most dangerous jihadist factions in West Africa. What followed became one of the most unsettling military losses of the year. According to senior military sources cited by multiple outlets, the convoy was returning from operations when it was ambushed by ISWAP fighters. The attack was so severe that the Army's initial public statements were confused and contradictory. First came denials that the general had been captured at all. Then days later, confirmation arrived. Brigadier General Musa Uba was dead. ISWAP released a video through its media channels claiming to show the general in captivity shortly before his execution. Days after that, tributes poured in. Nigeria's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu publicly described Uba as a hero. Senior commanders echoed the praise. The nation mourned. These facts are public. They are verified. What remains unanswered is how the ambush unfolded with such precision. According to reporting by Reuters, after the initial attack, General Uba managed to communicate with his base by phone. He shared his live location and requested immediate rescue. Multiple officers who later spoke to journalists said they believed that information may have been compromised, leaked, or intercepted, allowing ISWAP fighters to reach him before reinforcements could arrive. The Army did not publicly confirm how the breach occurred, but it did confirm the outcome. ISWAP reached the general first. Inside the armed forces, this detail raised alarms. The route Uba's convoy traveled was not unusual. Senior officers regularly moved between frontline positions. Yet the speed and accuracy with which ISWAP located him after the initial ambush fueled private concern among serving officers. Some pointed to communication vulnerabilities, a long-standing problem in Nigeria's war zones. Over the years, insurgents have seized military equipment during attacks, including radios, vehicles, and encrypted devices. Nigerian commanders have acknowledged this publicly in past briefings. Security analysts have long warned that through captured radios, unsecured communication channels, compromised intermediaries, or human intelligence, insurgents may be able to monitor or track military movements under certain conditions. This does not mean that encrypted civilian apps were breached. There is no evidence of that. But it does suggest that communications procedures under fire may be far more exposed than the public realizes. The alternative explanation discussed quietly within military circles was even more disturbing: the possibility that someone inside the security apparatus may have informed ISWAP about the general's movements. This fear was not born in a vacuum. In 2016, following a deadly Boko Haram attack in Gashua, Nigerian military intelligence arrested a major and a captain for allegedly leaking troop movements and operational plans to insurgents. Media reports at the time said the officers passed vital information to the enemy through civilian intermediaries. Those cases never became full public trials, but they have been repeatedly cited in academic studies as evidence of deep internal compromise within Nigeria's security system. There is no confirmed evidence linking an insider leak to General Uba's ambush. The military has not named suspects. No official investigative report has been released, and yet among officers the pattern was hard to ignore. After ISWAP released the execution video, the army condemned the killing publicly. Tributes continued. But beyond statements of honor and sacrifice, there was little transparency about what went wrong. No explanation of how the general was located so quickly. No confirmation of whether communications were intercepted. No public accounting of failures. For many within the armed forces, that silence spoke loudly. According to multiple sources, the death of Brigadier General Musa Uba intensified a long-standing fear inside Nigeria's military that militants are not always outmaneuvering soldiers on the battlefield. Sometimes they may be guided. Across Nigeria's conflict zones, reports of soldiers arrested for supplying ammunition, police officers caught transporting weapons, and informants tipping off attackers before raids have become increasingly common. These are not fringe allegations. They come from official arrests, court-martials, and government briefings. Operation Snowball had exposed betrayal at the armory. The ambush of a general suggested the consequences when such betrayal reaches the battlefield. And as the nation mourned, another question quietly settled in. If a senior commander could be found and killed this way, who else was vulnerable and why? While the military was still grappling with the shock of losing a senior commander, the consequences of Nigeria's security failures spilled violently into civilian life. On November 17, 2025, just minutes before dawn, the quiet of Kebbi State in northwestern Nigeria was shattered. Armed gunmen stormed the government girls' comprehensive secondary school in Maga, killing a vice principal and a security guard before abducting 25 schoolgirls. The girls were taken, swiftly loaded onto motorcycles, and vanished into the surrounding forests before any meaningful response could arrive. By itself, the attack was horrifying, but what followed made it politically explosive. According to multiple sources, security officials had received prior intelligence that schools in the region were at heightened risk of attack. In response, a military detachment had been deployed specifically to guard the Maga school. Parents were reassured. For several days, soldiers remained on site. Then, just hours before the kidnappers struck, the troops left. This was not rumor or speculation. The governor of Kebbi State, Nasir Idris, publicly confirmed that the military detachment had indeed been withdrawn shortly before the raid. Standing before reporters, he demanded answers: who ordered the withdrawal and why his statement triggered nationwide outrage. The Nigerian Army responded cautiously. It described the withdrawal as a routine changeover. No further operational details were provided, but the timing immediately became the focus of public scrutiny. Witnesses described the attackers as confident and organized, moving from building to building without resistance, selecting victims, and escaping without a firefight. For many Nigerians, it looked less like chance and more like perfect timing. There was once again no proof of insider collusion. No officer was publicly accused. No investigation results were released. But the same unsettling question returned. How did the attackers know the exact window when the school would be unprotected? This was not the first time Nigerians had asked that question. Across northern Nigeria, communities have reported eerily similar patterns for years. Military checkpoints abandoned hours before bandits arrive. Patrol routes altered on the very nights raids occur. Villages calling for help while attackers operate freely for hours. These accounts come from journalists, civil society organizations, and local leaders, not anonymous social media rumors. Individually, they prove nothing. Together, they form a pattern that has become impossible to ignore. Politically, the MAGA school kidnapping intensified an already fragile debate about Nigeria's security architecture. Public trust, already strained by years of violence, took another hit. Parents demanded to know why intelligence warnings did not translate into sustained protection. Governors questioned the chain of command. Civil society groups called for transparency, not condolences. Within days, security forces launched search and rescue operations. Local vigilante groups joined the effort. Helicopters patrolled forests, stretching across Kebbi, Zamfara, and Niger states. Eventually, most of the girls were found and rescued. But rescue did not erase the trauma. Families returned home changed. Communities were left with the familiar realization that safety had once again failed at the most critical moment. The political consequences went beyond Kebbi. The attack revived long-standing calls for state police regional security arrangements and stronger community-based defense systems. Not because Nigerians reject a unified national military, but because many no longer believe the current system can always be relied upon. When protection appears and disappears without explanation, trust erodes. For civilians, insecurity has become normalized. School kidnappings now form a grim timeline. Chibok in 2014, Kankara in 2020, and a growing list of towns whose names briefly dominate headlines before fading. Each incident leaves behind the same unresolved questions and the same quiet anger. The deeper cost is psychological. A generation of Nigerian children is growing up with a different understanding of safety, one shaped by lockdown drills, sudden school closures, and the fear that protection can vanish overnight. When communities begin to suspect that the state's absence consistently creates opportunity for attackers, the bond between citizens and government begins to fray. Operation Snowball exposed corruption within armories. The death of a general exposed vulnerability on the battlefield. The MAGA school kidnapping exposed the human cost when those failures reached civilians. And by then, the crisis was no longer just military. It had become political, personal, and profoundly national. From Washington to Brussels, Nigeria's security crisis is no longer viewed as a distant regional problem. It is increasingly seen as part of a wider global pattern, one where internal corruption, weak oversight, and prolonged conflict create space for extremist groups to survive, adapt, and spread. For American and international security analysts, the events surrounding Operation Snowball raised familiar concerns, not because Nigeria's challenges are unique, but because they echo failures seen in other long-running wars. International reporting, including coverage by Reuters, framed Operation Snowball as evidence that Nigeria's military leadership understands the threat posed by internal compromise. Yet those same reports also highlighted what global observers found troubling: the absence of transparency about scale and impact. No comprehensive accounting of diverted weapons was released. No estimate of how many attacks may have been enabled by stolen ammunition was provided. For Western analysts accustomed to metrics audits and after-action reports, those gaps matter. In the United States, Nigeria is often discussed through the lens of counterterrorism partnerships. American officials have long recognized Nigeria as a critical anchor of stability in West Africa, a country whose success or failure carries consequences far beyond its borders. Boko Haram and ISWAP are not just Nigerian problems. They are part of a transnational jihadist ecosystem that connects the Lake Chad Basin to the Sahel and beyond. When weapons leak from Nigerian stockpiles, they do not always stay within Nigeria. Security researchers in Europe and North America have repeatedly warned that arms diversion fuels regional instability, strengthening bandit groups, jihadist factions, and criminal networks across porous borders. From Niger to Chad to Mali, weapons move faster than governments can track them. In that context, Operation Snowball was not simply a domestic anti-corruption drive. It was a signal flare to the international community that Nigeria's internal vulnerabilities could have external consequences. American policymakers are also keenly aware of another lesson drawn from past conflicts: wars prolonged by corruption rarely end cleanly. Academic studies, including those published in journals like African Affairs, have documented sentiments among Nigerian frontline soldiers who believe the conflict continues because it benefits certain elites. That belief, whether fully accurate or not, matters. In U.S. military doctrine, morale and trust are treated as strategic assets. When soldiers suspect that sacrifice at the front is disconnected from accountability at the top, cohesion weakens. Globally, Nigeria's situation invites uncomfortable comparisons. Analysts point to Afghanistan, Iraq, and parts of the Sahel where underpaid troops, weak logistics systems, and elite corruption undermined years of international investment. In each case, the result was not sudden collapse, but slow erosion, missed warnings, compromised operations, and civilian populations caught in the middle. From a humanitarian perspective, international organizations tracking violence such as conflict monitoring groups and UN-linked agencies have recorded thousands of deaths annually from insurgency banditry and communal attacks in Nigeria. They have also documented a sharp rise in mass kidnappings, particularly of children. These numbers fluctuate year by year, but the trend remains deeply concerning. For global audiences, especially older Americans who remember earlier counterinsurgency failures, the pattern feels uncomfortably familiar. Yet there is also restraint in international commentary. Foreign governments rarely accuse Nigeria's military outright. Sovereignty matters. Evidence matters. But privately, diplomats and analysts continue to ask the same question Nigerians are asking at home: can a security system succeed if trust inside it keeps breaking down? Operation Snowball showed that Nigeria is willing to confront internal corruption. The world took note. But the death of a general, the kidnapping of schoolgirls, and the unanswered questions that followed reminded global observers of a harder truth. Accountability must reach beyond the lowest ranks, or insecurity will continue to travel from armories to battlefields, from villages to headlines, and eventually across borders. In the end, the true cost of military compromise cannot be measured in court-martial verdicts, seized bank accounts, or public statements from headquarters. It is measured in lives, in empty desks in classrooms that should be full, in villages abandoned because nightfall has become too dangerous, in soldiers who leave for deployment and never come home. Across Nigeria's conflict zones, the northeast, the northwest, and the middle belt, violence leaves behind a human trail that no statistic can fully capture. Monitoring groups and international agencies have documented thousands of deaths each year from insurgency banditry and communal attacks. They have also recorded a staggering rise in mass kidnappings, children taken from schools, travelers seized on highways, entire communities held hostage for ransom. The numbers vary by year, but the reality behind them never changes. Families shattered, futures cut short, a nation forced to grieve again and again. Nigerian officials and independent researchers have repeatedly warned that diverted weapons fuel both terrorism and banditry. Every bullet that leaves an armory through corruption eventually enters a conflict through violence. No government agency has released a precise accounting of how many attacks can be traced to stolen ammunition, but the pattern is unmistakable. The same weaknesses exposed by Operation Snowball manual records, weak oversight, uneven accountability, continue to feed the cycle Nigeria is desperately trying to break. There is also a quieter cost, one that rarely makes headlines, but may be the most dangerous of all: the erosion of trust. When soldiers arrive too late or not at all, when attackers move as if they know the terrain better than the people who live there, when communities warn of threats but feel unheard, something fundamental begins to fray between the people and the state. This is why calls for state police, regional security forces, and community-based protection have grown louder, not because Nigerians reject the idea of a unified national military, but because many fear the existing system cannot always be counted on. Trust once broken is hard to restore. For soldiers, the betrayal cuts even deeper. A soldier enters battle knowing the risks. What he does not expect is to be exposed by stolen ammunition, compromised information, or failures far above his rank. The death of Brigadier General Musa Uba became a symbol of this fear, not because the cause of his ambush has been proven, but because it embodied something many within the military already sensed: the enemy is not always in the forest. Sometimes the enemy is inside the system. Operation Snowball was not just a crackdown, it was a warning. A warning that a security system does not need to be universally corrupt to be catastrophically vulnerable. A single unchecked register, a missing audit, one signature on a form, and national security quietly turns into national insecurity. So the question remains, not just for Nigeria, but for every country watching from afar: can a nation defeat terror if it cannot fully trust itself? If you believe this question deserves honest answers beyond official headlines, please share your thoughts in the comments. Share this video if you feel the truth matters more than silence. And subscribe if you believe understanding the roots of insecurity is the first step toward breaking the cycle.